Hey everybody, Thomas here, just making a bit more Kickstarter content for you. Still promoting the Mixed Signals Kickstarter campaign, which you can donate to now on Kickstarter, or you can buy merch from Redbubble. And yeah, as days go on, I want to talk more and more about the film, like who's involved and what's the thought process behind a lot of the decisions, and yeah. So, for today, I thought I would share how the character rigs are going to work in this movie because, I figured most people donating, especially like family members and just close friends and stuff like that, they're probably going to hear that most of the film is being made with character rigs, but they're not exactly going to know what that is. And they're not going, because, if you're not in the industry, it's not immediately obvious what that means. So I thought I would break it down for you folks, and hopefully you find it interesting, and yeah. So, in the most broad of terms, a character rig is basically a puppet in the 2D animation software Toon Boom Harmony. Have you ever seen a film that used 2D handcrafted puppets made out of construction paper, and they had like those little pegs that made it so they can rotate the limbs around and stuff like that? Well, this is the same basic concept, only it's completely done in the computer and it's a little more advanced. So I'll show you what that looks like. So I'll select the body here of our titular character, the little robot. Not titular, the title's not the little robot, but you know what I mean. If I select that, it means that I can move the body independently as I please, like that. Or, if I cycle up the rig a little bit, I can select more pieces. Now the shadow is moving alongside it. Let's go even further than that. And now the whole upper body is selected, and I can move it around as I choose. I can skew it, I can squish it, and I can rotate it as I was showing you before, and I can move it around and stuff like that. And everything in these builds is made with this basic philosophy. Everything has a hierarchy. If we actually go into the rig itself, it looks like this big tree full of all of little bits and pieces and stuff like that. And essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be manipulating the body here, and we're going to be putting it in all sorts of different poses, and then we're going to fill in the gaps. So yeah, and all of the pieces work like this. The head works like this, the arms work like this, and so on and so forth. And so you have different pegs for different things, like this one here it controls the size, and that's why the anchor point, as we call it, is right here, because that's an easier way of controlling size. And we got a placement master here, and yeah, and so on and so forth. So yeah, and there's quite a bit going on in this. So for the antenna, if we turn on the controllers here, these little bits make it so I can control the shape and positioning of the antenna as I please. And I can like widen this bit or make it more narrow. And if I move this one, you'll notice that the satellite dish moves along with it. And that is because of a thing called a kinematic output that connects this to that. So it's much easier to animate something that's supposed to be dragging on top of that. And all the pieces, they also have these shadows inside, and they also have some controllers on them that let me control the shape of them to be whatever I want. And speaking of the shadows, if we turn on the render view here, they get all blurry. And this is because of a node that I put on, or a filter. I put on both a transparency filter and a blur filter, so that when the video is rendered, it's not going to look like this. It's going to apply the blur and all that when I render it, and it's going to look more like this in the final shot. And you can also do other things, like you can swap out individual pieces. So if I don't want the satellite dish to look like this, I can switch it to over here, And now it looks like this. It's more front-facing. And I can give it a more profile view, I can make it face the back, and I can add more positions as time goes on. So let's say I want it to slightly change. What I do is I add a new drawing, and this is a completely new drawing that's different from the one that I showed you before, and I can change it as I see fit, and that will make animating some bits much easier. So yeah, and a bunch of parts in the build work like this. The hands work like this, the feet work like this, and yeah. So that's essentially how it's done, and there's plenty of other like little doohickeys and builds like this too. So for instance, the screen here, if we select that, you'll notice that if I take it within a certain bound, it suddenly disappears. It's not visible behind the head, or past the head, rather. And this is very important because it makes it so there's less errors when it comes to putting the screen in places it shouldn't be. And it helps hide the screen better in places where, for instance, maybe it's not supposed to be visible from our angle. Maybe it's supposed to be behind the head rather than in front of it. And yeah, and the shadows work the exact same way. They're also masked in, as you would say. And yeah, there's also some splines here. Splines are 2-point deformation chains that just kind of create basic angles for arms and legs and stuff. So you can move that around and the hand moves along with it. And you can also create new drawings for the arms. And you'll notice that the arm straightens back out when I create a new drawing. This is because I deliberately rigged it so that not every drawing is forced to have that deformation chain that I just showed you, and that makes it easier for manipulating the arms and putting them in more specific positions that I otherwise wouldn't be able to put them in. So yeah, that gives me a little bit more liberty in making them do specific things, but if I ever want this arm to follow the deformation chain that I put on before, so for instance, let's grow that just as a demonstration. If I do this, bam, it now follows that same chain that I had before, only the arm looks different, and this helps with depth and you know, forced perspective and stuff like that. And it helps tween a little easier down the road. And if you're wondering what tweening is, we will get to that. So yeah, a bunch of parts of the body are made with these deformers. The head has these deformers, and that makes it easier to animate in-betweens. And yeah, there's a drop shadow down here, also has deformers on it. And if you go into the render view, bam, it also has the blur, it also has the transparency. And yeah. So that's what it is for the most part. Now, you'll notice for the screen here, there's a little thing that says gradient, and there's a blue box around the screen there. So these things are here for the express purpose of making some things about the build easier to select. So the gradient, for instance, you'll notice that if I turn the render view on, it's invisible. So what that means is that that red button will not show up in the final scene. But the purpose of this button is to make the blue tint of the screen easier for me to manipulate. Because it would be hard to select otherwise. And it makes things, and because it's on top of a few things, it also makes things underneath it harder to select. Speaking of which, this blue box around the screen, same principle. It also has some deformers on it that I can manipulate the perspective of. You might be wondering, what is it manipulating the perspective of? The answer is whatever movie is supposed to be playing in the head. So I can put in a 1920 by 1080p film in there by importing it into Harmony. I can plug it right into the build, and that will make it so that film will follow the perspective shifting of this while still playing normally. And that's how we get films playing within character screens, but they're a little easier to distort and they're easier to adjust according to the perspective of the head. So yeah, and the square, same thing as the gradient button. It does not appear in the render view. So yeah, that's the gist of how these things work. And I promised you I would show you what tweening is. Tweening is when you let the computer fill in the gaps for you between poses. So let me show you an example. Let's say that I want this position to animate into this position. What I could do is I could turn on motion tweens and the computer will fill in the gaps for me. Look at that. And obviously it's not perfect. It won't swap out drawings on its own, and it won't make it look good on its own. It's more for like an approximation sort of thing, and it will ultimately still be up to you or whoever's animating to give it like that nice, appealing touch. But this helps you get past a lot of the legwork of figuring out exactly where things are supposed to be. And yeah, and you can also control the pacing of this by manipulating on the timeline or using this graph or whatever, and that makes it so you can control the easing and the speed of how much it goes. Like you know, because I changed it a little bit, it's suddenly a little faster. You see that? And there are a number of other issues that are taken into account too. For instance, let's say you manipulate the satellite dish here, to tweak that. Let's say you want the satellite dish to be in front of the rest of the head, which will come into play sometimes. You can select the whole thing, hit Alt down, and that puts it in front, just like that. And pretty well everything in the build is manipulable like this. You can put the arm in front, you can put the head further back if you want to, whatever. So yeah, almost the entire film is animated like this. There are a few exceptions. There's a traditional segment at one point, and there's 3D animation here and there, but for the most part, this is how the film is made. And there you go. If this was of interest to you, I sincerely hope you'll consider donating to the Kickstarter or buying some merch from Redbubble. It really means a lot to me, the amount of support we've already seen. So yeah, hope you found this interesting. Take care.